It had been an ordinary evening. After a long day, I was finally settled on the couch, a quiet hum of the television keeping me company in the otherwise silent house. The sun had just set, and a gentle darkness filled the room. It was almost 6 o'clock, and I was looking forward to unwinding, shutting off my mind for a while. But just as I was getting comfortable, the lights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging the entire house into a deep, unsettling darkness. I sighed, thinking it was yet another neighborhood blackout. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, so I tried not to let it bother me. Grabbing my phone, I switched on the flashlight and made my way to the kitchen, its narrow beam lighting my path. I remembered I'd stashed some candles in a drawer somewhere, and they'd be enough to hold me over until the power returned. The house was silent, each step I took echoing in the emptiness. But something about this darkness felt heavier than usual. As I rummaged through the drawer, the faint shuffle of footsteps reached my ears, muffled but unmistakable. I froze, listening intently, my senses heightened by the blackout. The sound was coming from the backyard, moving slowly and deliberately, growing louder as it neared the house. My pulse quickened, the steady thud in my chest matching the rhythm of those shuffling steps. Taking a deep breath, I directed the flashlight toward the backyard window, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. There, on the edge of the light, I saw him. A figure, standing just outside, shrouded in shadow. His features were hidden, but I could tell he was watching, waiting. I couldn't make out his face, only the outline of his form, tall and unnaturally still. He was close enough that I could sense his gaze, as if he knew exactly where I was. A chill ran through me, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I took a step back, hoping he hadn't noticed me watching him, my heart pounding as I imagined what he might do next. I had no idea who he was or why he was there, but every instinct told me to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that figure standing in the darkness. Without a second thought, I backed out of the kitchen, making my way down the hallway as quickly and quietly as I could. I felt exposed, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me even though he was outside. My steps were careful but urgent, my mind racing with the possibilities of who he could be and what he might want. The power was out, the phone line dead. There was no way to reach anyone, no one to call for help. I slipped into my bedroom, locking the door behind me, hoping it would be enough to keep him out if he decided to approach the house. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door, straining to listen for any sound that might tell me if he'd left or was still lurking outside. My mind replayed the image of him standing there, watching, as if he were waiting for something. I tried to convince myself he'd leave, that maybe he was just lost or confused. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something worse, that he was here for a reason. And then, breaking the tense silence, I heard it. The sharp, unmistakable sound of glass shattering from the kitchen. The figure outside had made his way in. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to grab my phone, my fingers trembling as I quickly dialed for the police. My heart pounded in my ears, each second stretching into an eternity as I waited for the line to connect. When the faint sound of the operator's voice finally came through, I felt a glimmer of relief, a fleeting hope that help was on its way. But just as quickly as the call connected, my phone screen went black, leaving me staring at the empty screen. The battery had died. I was trapped in the dark, cut off from any contact with the outside world. My isolation grew, wrapping around me like a suffocating weight, the silence more oppressive than ever as I realized I had no way to call for help. From the other side of the door, the sounds from the kitchen grew louder. The stranger was rummaging through my cabinets, smashing plates and glasses, each crash louder than the last. It felt deliberate, like he wanted me to hear, to know he was there. I pressed myself against the door, my breath shallow, each loud crash reverberating through the house, each one a reminder of how close he was. I was helpless, trapped in my own home with nowhere to go, waiting for whatever would come next. The sounds from the kitchen escalated, each crash louder than the last, shattering the stillness of the house. I could hear the stranger tearing through drawers, yanking open cabinets and throwing plates and glasses to the floor. Every crash sent a jolt through me, making my heart pound harder, my breath shallow and panicked. It felt as though he was sending a message, a warning that he was in control and that I was powerless to stop him. I stayed pressed against the door, frozen in place, listening as the intruder continued his rampage. Each sound was a fresh reminder that he was just on the other side of the house, so close that I could almost feel the vibrations through the floor. My mind raced, desperate to come up with a plan, but each thought was clouded by the overwhelming fear gripping me. I could feel the walls closing in, trapping me in this small, dark room with no way to escape. Then, something changed. The chaotic noise started to slow, the crashes and bangs coming less frequently, as if he'd finished tearing apart the kitchen. A chilling silence began to settle over the house, an eerie calm that was almost worse than the noise. I held my breath, listening, waiting, wondering if he was still there or if he'd moved to another part of the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was close, lurking just outside, waiting for me to make a mistake. The silence was suffocating. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, any hint of movement, but there was nothing. My own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet, each shallow breath echoing in the darkness of the room. I could feel my muscles tensing, every nerve on edge, my mind racing with the fear of what he might do next. Had he left? Or was he standing just outside, waiting? Minutes passed, then more, each second stretching into an eternity. I didn't dare open the door, didn't dare make a sound, terrified that even the smallest noise would reveal my hiding spot. My thoughts shifted between hope that he was gone and the gnawing fear that he was still there, somewhere in the house, watching, waiting. I felt trapped, paralyzed by fear, every instinct screaming for me to stay hidden. Then, from somewhere down the hall, a faint sound, a floorboard creaking. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, barely breathing, listening as another quiet creak echoed down the hallway. He was still there, moving slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the tension, the fear that he knew he was instilling in me. I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing with the thought that he might be coming closer, that at any moment he would reach my door. The hours passed, each one blending into the next, my body rigid with fear as I waited in the darkness. Every creak, every faint noise sent a fresh wave of terror through me, each one hinting at the possibility that he was still in the house, just beyond the door. I sat on the floor, too afraid to move, my back pressed against the door as if my weight alone could keep it shut. The night dragged on, my mind torn between exhaustion and adrenaline, keeping me on high alert. My eyes strained to adjust to the darkness, my ears sensitive to even the smallest sound. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the earlier noises, if the intruder had truly left, or if he was simply waiting for me to let my guard down. The house felt different, as if it were holding its breath, each shadow in the room deepening the sense of isolation. I lost track of time, the hours blending together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every now and then, I would hear a distant creak, a subtle shift, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. All I could do was wait, trapped in this cycle of fear and anticipation, my thoughts spiraling as the silence closed in around me. Finally, the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, casting a faint glow across the room. The sight of it brought a wave of relief, a small comfort after the long, torturous night. I waited a few minutes longer, gathering the courage to leave my room, to face whatever might be waiting outside. My muscles ached as I stood, my legs weak from hours of sitting tense and motionless on the floor. Cautiously, I unlocked the door, the soft click seeming too loud in the silence. I stepped out into the hallway, my breath shallow as I moved slowly, carefully, toward the kitchen. The house was still, the morning light revealing the chaos that lay ahead. As I entered the kitchen, my stomach twisted at the sight before me. Shattered plates, broken glasses, drawers pulled open, their contents strewn across the floor. The window was broken, glass glinting on the floor, a reminder of how he'd gained entry. But of the man himself, there was no sign. He was gone, leaving only the mess and a lingering sense of violation in his wake. I felt a chill as I surveyed the damage, a haunting reminder of the terror I'd experienced. The forest stretched out before me, vast and untouched, its edges shrouded in a light morning mist that clung to the trees. I'd been camping for years, but there was something about this particular forest that had always called to me, a wildness, an air of mystery that I couldn't quite define. Setting down my pack, I began to assemble my campsite, feeling the thrill of solitude settling in, away from the endless noise and routine of daily life. It was just me, my tent, and the quiet embrace of the trees. Once I had my tent pitched and supplies arranged, I paused, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Birds chirped in the canopy above, leaves rustled as a breeze swept through, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the air. I felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom, a comforting isolation. Satisfied, I decided it was time to gather firewood, my mind on the simple comforts of a warm fire and the glow of stars above. I wandered away from my campsite, picking up fallen branches and logs as I went, venturing a bit farther than I intended. But the forest was captivating, each step drawing me deeper, and before I realized it, I'd lost sight of where I'd come from. I glanced around, slightly disoriented, but convinced I could find my way back with ease. After a few minutes of retracing my steps, I stopped, feeling a hint of unease. The familiar landmarks I'd been following were nowhere to be found, and each path seemed to lead me in circles. I tried to remember the direction of my campsite, but the trees had a way of blending together, forming an impenetrable wall around me. Every direction looked the same, just endless rows of thick trunks and underbrush. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The light grew dimmer with each passing minute, leaving me feeling more isolated. I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on small markers and trying to create a mental map, but each attempt to orient myself only deepened my confusion. I was no stranger to the outdoors, but something about this forest felt different, almost as if it were hiding something, keeping me from finding my way. A chill ran through me as I realized that night was fast approaching and I was nowhere near my campsite. Panic began to settle in, a quiet dread creeping up my spine as the light continued to fade. I knew spending the night lost in this forest would be far from easy, but I steeled myself, convincing myself it was just a matter of time before I found my bearings. As darkness settled over the forest, the trees seemed to shift, taking on strange shapes in the twilight. My footsteps sounded louder, echoing through the silence that had fallen. I kept my eyes forward, scanning for any familiar landmark, any sign of the way back. Then, just beyond a thicket of trees, I saw it, a shadow drifting between the trunks. My heart skipped a beat as I watched, unable to look away. It was a figure, moving deliberately, as if aware of my presence. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but something felt off. The shape was indistinct, more shadow than substance, and it seemed to blend into the darkness as it moved. My pulse quickened as I watched it drift in and out of the trees, silent and unhurried, its movements calculated. I forced myself to breathe, taking a shaky step back. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I reasoned, or just my mind playing games with me in the dark. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, a weight pressing down on me as I forced myself to turn away and keep moving. The shadow lingered in my mind, a creeping sense of dread settling over me as I tried to convince myself that I was alone. The further I walked, the more I became aware of the sounds around me, faint and unsettling. Footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, the snap of a twig somewhere close, a whisper carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. Each sound felt deliberate, calculated, as if it were following me, matching my pace. Panic surged as I quickened my steps, glancing over my shoulder, hoping to catch sight of whoever, or whatever, might be following me. But the forest remained empty, its shadows stretching in every direction, swallowing any sign of life. The whispers grew louder, close enough that I felt I could almost make out words, though they were too faint to understand. I felt a primal urge to run, but I knew the darkness would only disorient me further, leaving me at the mercy of the shadow that lurked in the trees. Desperate, I made a split-second decision to climb a nearby tree, hoping the height would offer safety, and maybe even a view of my campsite. My hands trembled as I gripped the rough bark, pulling myself up until I was nestled among the branches, hidden from whatever might be watching below. I clung to the trunk, every muscle tense as I peered down, scanning the ground for any sign of movement. And there it was, the figure, slowly walking through the underbrush, its movements almost hypnotic, like it was searching for something. My breath caught, and I held perfectly still, afraid to even breathe as it passed below me, its form barely visible in the faint moonlight. I watched in silence, my fear mounting as the shadow circled the area, its presence a constant reminder of my vulnerability. The hours dragged on, each second stretching as I clung to the rough bark of the tree. The forest below was blanketed in shadow, a landscape of dark shapes and rustling sounds. My legs were cramped, my hands raw from gripping the branches, but I didn't dare move. The figure had disappeared into the underbrush, yet I felt its presence all around me, a silent threat lurking just out of sight. I scanned the darkness below, hoping to catch sight of my campfire or the outline of my tent, anything to anchor me to something familiar. But all I saw were trees stretching endlessly, the faint outline of the forest floor obscured in darkness. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle, the snap of a branch, each sound amplified by the isolation. I felt exposed, as if the figure could see me even from this height. Suddenly, movement caught my eye, a shifting shadow at the base of a tree just a few yards away. I tensed, watching as the shadow drifted through the underbrush, deliberate and unhurried, as if it were searching. I held my breath, every muscle in my body straining to remain still, hoping it wouldn't sense my presence above. It moved slowly, its form blending into the shadows, until finally it disappeared once again into the depths of the forest. The night stretched on, and the forest seemed alive with sounds, footsteps in the distance, soft murmurs, the rustling of branches. I hugged the trunk of the tree, my arms numb from the cold, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if I climbed down. Every instinct told me to stay put, to wait for daylight, but the weight of fear pressed down on me, a constant reminder of the presence lurking below. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind, every creak of the branches felt like a threat. I strained to see through the darkness, feeling as if the figure might return at any moment, but all I saw were the shapes of trees stretching into the blackness. My thoughts wandered to stories of the forest, of people disappearing, of strange occurrences that had no explanation. Alone in the tree, I felt the depth of the forest's mystery, as if it were hiding something ancient and unkind, waiting for intruders like me. As the hours wore on, I began to lose track of time, my mind slipping between moments of clarity and hazy fear. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the branches above and shadows below merging into one ominous presence. I kept my eyes open, afraid to blink, afraid that the figure would return the moment I let my guard down. At last, the faintest hint of light began to creep into the forest, casting a gray glow over the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my muscles aching from hours of tension. The morning light revealed the forest in a new way, the shadows lifting, making everything look smaller, less menacing. I scanned the forest floor from my perch, and finally, relief washed over me. I could see my campsite in the distance, the faint outline of my tent barely visible through the trees. Cautiously, I climbed down, my body protesting each movement, my legs wobbly from hours spent in the tree. I kept my eyes on the ground, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. Just the empty forest, quiet and unassuming in the early morning light. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on each step, moving carefully as I made my way back to my campsite. The closer I got, the more the fear began to lift, replaced by a deep exhaustion and an overwhelming urge to leave. I reached my tent, still intact, my gear untouched, as if the night had been nothing but a bad dream. But the memory of the shadowy figure lingered, a reminder that something had been out there, watching. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking as I dismantled my tent, eager to leave the forest behind. Each sound around me felt amplified, and though the figure was nowhere to be seen, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of its slow, deliberate movements haunted me, a constant reminder that something unexplainable had been out there in the dark. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see a shadow following me, lurking just beyond the trees. The fear had settled into my bones, an unease that clung to me even as I left the forest behind. The trees thinned, the sunlight breaking through, but the weight of the night stayed with me, a lingering reminder of what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. By the time I reached my car, I was physically unscathed, but my mind felt marked by the experience, haunted by the presence that had followed me in the night. As I drove away, the forest faded in my rearview mirror, but the image of the shadow, moving silently through the trees, remained etched in my memory. It was just another day, or so I thought. I'd left home early, making my way to my regular coffee spot to kickstart the morning with a fresh cup. I knew the routine so well. Stand in line, wait for the usual barista, order my usual coffee, maybe browse my phone as I waited. The line was busy, filled with familiar faces of people lost in their own thoughts, and I found a certain calm in the predictability of it all. As I neared the counter, I felt a presence behind me, someone stepping in close, just outside of my peripheral vision. I shifted slightly but thought nothing of it. There were always people passing through, brushing past one another in crowded spaces like this. But then he spoke, his voice cutting through the chatter, unnaturally direct. "You're Jason, right?" he asked, his tone uncomfortably intense. I turned, meeting the gaze of a man with a fixed, unblinking stare. His expression was severe, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny, like he was studying me, waiting for my answer. My mind blanked for a second before I finally replied, telling him that he had the wrong person. But as I spoke, his eyes narrowed, and I could see a tension there, something dark lingering just beneath the surface. The stranger didn't seem to believe me. Instead of backing off, he stepped closer, as if testing my response. "Don't mess with me, Jason," he said, his voice low, carrying a distinct note of irritation. He was close enough now that I could smell the sharp, almost overpowering scent of his cologne, something bitter that made my skin prickle. The way he looked at me, intense, unyielding, sent a chill down my spine. I repeated that he was mistaken, my voice more hesitant this time, unsettled by his unwavering stare. His expression darkened, and he shook his head slightly, as if in disbelief. "You owe me," he said, each word heavy, edged with a kind of quiet menace. "And it's time to settle up." The way he said it, so calm yet loaded with a sense of finality, was unsettling. I wanted to step back, to put distance between us, but his gaze held me in place. I tried to think of what to say, how to convince him that he had the wrong person, but the intensity of his glare, the certainty in his eyes, left me speechless. Other patrons in the coffee shop had started to take notice, their curious glances flicking between us, but no one made a move to intervene. The stranger's accusations grew sharper, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You think I'd forget your face?" he asked, his voice rough with anger. "I don't care what name you use now, you can't hide forever." Each word felt like a blow, pushing me further into a corner, and my pulse quickened as a sense of helplessness began to set in. I tried to de-escalate, to keep my voice calm, telling him once again that he was mistaken, that he was confusing me with someone else. But he wasn't interested in explanations. His stare was cold, unrelenting, and it felt as though he saw right through me, convinced that I was lying. I took a breath, louder this time, hoping to draw more attention, hoping someone might step in. But people continued to watch, hesitant and uncertain, leaving me trapped in the stranger's grip. By now, the stranger had closed the distance between us, blocking my path, his body language tense, his voice turning aggressive. "You can't hide forever, Jason," he hissed, his voice low but carrying a menacing weight. His words echoed in my mind, leaving me with a sickening sense of dread. I felt trapped, as if every exit had been sealed, every attempt to escape thwarted. I raised my voice, insisting that he had the wrong person, but he didn't even flinch. Instead, his eyes narrowed, the intensity in them almost feral, and he seemed to savor my fear, feeding off of it. I glanced around, my silent plea for help clear in my expression, but no one moved, the tension hanging thick in the air. Finally, a barista approached us, asking if there was a problem, her voice filled with apprehension. The stranger shot her a look, muttering something under his breath, but didn't move his gaze from me. He leaned in close, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. "This isn't over." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaken and uncertain of what had just happened. As the stranger walked away, I stood frozen in place, my heart still racing. It took a few moments for me to process that he was gone, that the immediate threat had passed. I looked around, the eyes of the other patrons quickly averting as I met their gaze, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The barista, who'd bravely asked if everything was okay, gave me a worried look. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. I forced myself to nod, managing a shaky yes that didn't sound convincing even to my own ears. My hands were trembling, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I could feel the eyes of the crowd on me, their silent judgment only adding to my sense of isolation. I felt vulnerable, exposed, as though everyone around me had witnessed something deeply personal, a confrontation I didn't understand and couldn't explain. I left the coffee shop quickly, my mind racing, hoping that putting distance between myself and the place might help calm my nerves. The fear didn't fade. Even after I was outside, walking quickly through the familiar streets, I felt as if the stranger's presence was following me, his words echoing in my mind, "This isn't over." Each step I took felt weighted, as though his eyes were still on me, watching from somewhere in the crowd. My skin prickled with the uncomfortable sensation of being followed, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him trailing behind me, that same menacing gaze fixed on me. The once familiar streets took on an eerie quality, each passerby a potential threat. I quickened my pace, feeling a sense of relief only when I finally stepped into the safety of my own home. But even then, the walls that had always made me feel secure now felt thin, almost transparent, as if he could see through them, watching, waiting. I tried to shake the feeling, but the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. Over the next few days, the stranger's words lingered, embedding themselves in my thoughts, each one a reminder of the tension that had gripped me in the coffee shop. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might return, that any moment I'd turn a corner and see him there, waiting. Each time I left the house, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning crowds for his face. Even the coffee shop, once my regular spot, now felt like a place of dread. The thought of stepping back in there, of risking another encounter, filled me with a fear I couldn't ignore. My routine became fractured, each step outside tinged with paranoia, each familiar face seeming to take on a new, suspicious quality. Friends noticed my distraction, asking if something was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain it. How could I? I wasn't even sure myself of what had happened, what he'd meant. We had driven out past the edges of familiar trails, where the trees grew denser and roads turned to dirt paths. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we finally found a clearing far from any other campers, exactly what we were looking for, total seclusion. The air was thick with the earthy smell of pine, and only the occasional call of a distant bird broke the silence. Setting up camp took us longer than expected, but the sense of isolation, the real wilderness around us, felt like a reward for the long journey. We pitched the tent near a low rise that offered a view of the sprawling forest beneath. It felt safe but exposed, a strange paradox that left me both comforted and unsettled. The silence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I let the sounds of the woods fill my ears. The rustle of leaves, the whisper of a breeze threading through branches, it was a rhythm both calming and foreign. Slowly sleep took hold, easing away the last thoughts of city noise and crowds, leaving only the quiet, unbroken dark. When I finally drifted off, I had no sense of how the night would unfold. But for now, everything was serene, as if the forest was welcoming us in. Little did I know it would only be for that one night. Morning sunlight seeped through the thin walls of the tent, and I stirred awake, feeling the kind of peace that only comes from a good night's sleep in the wilderness. But as I stepped out, stretching and taking in the cool morning air, I noticed something that immediately threw me off balance. Long, jagged scratches ran down one side of the tent. I leaned in close, tracing a finger over the marks, each one thin but unmistakably deliberate. They ran parallel to each other, almost like claw marks, but not quite. It wasn't the first thing I'd expected to see after a quiet night. At first, I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably some curious raccoon or a fox nosing around. But as I looked closer, that explanation felt less certain. There were no tracks around the tent, no disturbed soil or broken twigs, nothing to suggest an animal had been there. The realization settled in slowly, a heavy sensation in my chest. It was strange, unnatural even, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. I glanced around the trees, half expecting to see a shadow darting back into the forest, but everything was still. Just me, standing there in the morning chill, a sense of unease creeping over me like a slow fog. As the sun began to sink once more beneath the trees, a shadow of tension followed us back to the campsite. The discovery of those scratches had done something to the air around us, turned it heavy and watchful. Every whisper of wind, every creak of the forest seemed amplified, as if the trees were holding secrets, waiting for us to slip up and look away. When we settled into the tent that night, sleep didn't come easily. We'd planned this trip to get away from the noise of everyday life, but out here, every sound felt deliberate, each snap of a branch or rustle of leaves prying at our nerves. I tried to rationalize it, just forest noises, the usual nighttime sounds, but the logic didn't settle the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at my thoughts. Hours stretched on as I lay awake, acutely aware of every breath, every shift in the wind. It was like waiting for something unseen to happen, a suspense that seemed to thicken as the night deepened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a light, uneasy sleep, the silence around us pressing in close, like the forest itself was listening. The morning brought a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Stepping outside, I noticed right away that the scratches had returned, only this time they were deeper, running across the tent in erratic, jagged lines. They gouged into the fabric, more pronounced than the ones we'd found the morning before. I swallowed hard, tracing the edge of one particularly deep line that seemed almost like a message, though I couldn't guess what it was trying to say. My heart raced as I examined the tent, hoping for some rational answer that would make the mark seem ordinary, explainable. But, once again, the ground around us was undisturbed. No paw prints, no scuffed dirt, nothing out of place. Just the silent, indifferent forest surrounding us, standing like a wall. I could see the tension in my companions' faces, though no one said much. We avoided eye contact, kept busy, each of us pretending not to feel the invisible weight that had settled over the campsite. As much as we wanted to pack up and leave, something held us back. Maybe it was pride or the desire not to let fear ruin our plans. Either way, we convinced ourselves we could handle it, that the scratches were just an anomaly, something we'd laugh about later. But deep down, I knew none of us truly believed that. The forest had shifted and the shadows felt closer, watching, waiting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite, a quiet tension blanketed us. We avoided looking directly at the tent, as if ignoring it might undo the bizarre events of the past 2 nights. The scratches, the sense of something unseen, each small disturbance had twisted what should have been a peaceful retreat into a silent nightmare. When darkness fell, we sat huddled around the faint glow of a lantern, speaking in murmurs that trailed off into silence. The weight of the unknown, of not understanding what was happening, pressed on us like the forest itself had closed in. That night, I lay down fully dressed, shoes on, ready to bolt if anything felt out of place. I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried not to let my mind spiral into dark corners, but every creak of a branch felt loaded. Every rustle amplified until my heart pounded in my chest. Time slipped by slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. When sleep finally took me, it was fitful, a thin surface of rest where every snap or crackle jolted me awake. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that it was all in my head. But somewhere in the deep silence I could feel it. A presence, something beyond the boundary of the tent, biding its time. In the dead of night, I was pulled from a shallow sleep by a sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scraping against the fabric of the tent, louder than before. I froze, my heart hammering as I lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't random or tentative, it was purposeful, as if testing, prying, inching closer. Each scratch against the nylon sent a shock through my body. and I felt the weight of something I couldn't see pressing in. I could hear it moving, circling the tent with unhurried steps, dragging something sharp and heavy along the walls, almost as if savoring each mark it left behind. The pressure of the claws against the fabric stretched it to the point of tearing, and I held my breath, feeling the fragile material of the tent quiver beneath the invisible force. I knew then that this wasn't an animal. Animals didn't behave like this. They didn't linger, didn't haunt with such deliberate intent. I lay there in silence, the others as motionless as I was, each of us paralyzed by a primal fear we couldn't voice. We stayed like that for hours, waiting for dawn, as the creature, whatever it was, continued its slow, menacing path around us, carving its intentions into the nylon. When dawn finally broke, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with dread as I unzipped the tent flap, bracing myself for what I'd find. The outside was bathed in early morning light, but it felt hollow, as though the forest had been drained of life. My gaze landed on the tent, now covered in claw marks, some deep enough to pierce straight through, fraying the edges where the material had split. The once small scratches had transformed into deep gashes, wild and unrestrained, like the signature of something that wanted to be known. Each mark seemed to taunt us, a silent challenge to stay one more night, to test our resolve. I looked at my companions and saw the same horror reflected in their faces, each of us reading the same conclusion in the damage that surrounded us. There was no mistaking it. Something was pushing the limits, testing our courage, daring us to stay. We packed up quickly, hands shaking as we dismantled the tent, stuffing sleeping bags and gear into backpacks with no care for organization. The forest, which had once felt inviting, now felt like a trap, each shadow a reminder of the night that had passed. I felt the lingering eyes of something unseen as we shouldered our bags and began the trek back, not once looking over my shoulder. The walk back through the forest felt surreal, each step carrying us farther from the terrifying unknown we'd just escaped. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of an animal, set my nerves on edge, making me walk faster, eyes fixed on the path ahead. We didn't stop to rest, didn't speak. It was as if breaking the silence would invite whatever had been out there to follow. Once we finally reached the safety of the car, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. I had been meaning to fix the draft for weeks. It was a chill that seeped through the hallway, constant and unsettling, as if something was bleeding through the walls. I figured it was a crack, some small opening where the cold air from outside slipped through. So, armed with my usual repair tools, I knelt down by the baseboards, running my hand along the wall, feeling for any signs of weakness. As I pressed against the wall, I noticed something unusual. Beneath the layers of paint and wallpaper, a faint line stretched vertically, almost like an outline of a doorframe hidden in plain sight. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I leaned in, tracing the outline with my fingertips, pushing gently. My heart skipped as the wall suddenly gave way with a soft, unsettling click, almost as if it were unlocking itself. A narrow gap opened, revealing a dark doorway I'd never seen before. I peered into the shadowy space, half expecting to see the unfinished insides of a wall. But what lay beyond was different, a small, dark room. I felt a surge of adrenaline and an inexplicable urge to step inside, to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden behind these walls. For a moment, I just stood there, grappling with the strangeness of it all, the quiet hum of something unknown drawing me in. With a deep breath, I crossed the threshold, stepping into the hidden room, and immediately, the air changed. It was colder, an almost unnatural chill that settled into my bones. The smell was faintly metallic, like old iron or dried blood, hanging in the stillness. I had expected dust, cobwebs, something to show that this space had been forgotten. But to my surprise, the room was remarkably clean, as though someone had been using it not long ago. In the center of the room was a wooden table, cluttered with objects that felt completely out of place. A coffee cup sat on its surface, the rim stained and slightly chipped, as if someone had just taken a sip. Next to it was a small clock, its hands ticking away softly in the silence, keeping time in a space that had no reason to. A stack of yellowed notebooks lay beside the clock, their edges frayed but the pages clearly cared for. I scanned the room, noting other unsettling details: a neatly folded blanket draped over a chair, a half-burned candle with wax pooled around it. It was as though the room was waiting for someone to return. A chill crept up my spine as I looked around, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. Every object in the room a reminder that this place, hidden for who knows how long, had not been abandoned. The more I looked, the clearer it became that someone had been here recently. Footprints marked the thin layer of dust on the floor, leading from the table to the doorway where I stood. My gaze settled on the notebooks, each one marked with hasty, scrawled notes. I picked one up, flipping through pages filled with symbols and phrases that I couldn't understand. They looked like they had been written in a hurry, some of the ink smudged, as if by a hand that had moved too quickly. A chill gripped me as I read, my eyes catching fragments of phrases that hinted at plans, strange observations, notes that felt like records of someone's life in this hidden room. My fingers tingled as I realized the disturbing truth. This room was not abandoned, nor was it forgotten. Someone had been living here, concealed within my walls, without me ever noticing. The thought planted a seed of dread, growing into a tangible fear that crawled up my spine. I backed away from the table, my eyes scanning the small space, searching for any other signs that might explain what I was seeing. But each detail only deepened the horror. Someone had hidden this room away, kept it secret, living just feet away from where I slept, without me ever knowing. I couldn't resist the pull of the notebooks, something in them demanding to be read, to be understood. I flipped through the pages, each one littered with strange symbols and fragmented notes, phrases that seemed like instructions or records of events. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if whoever had written them had little time and even less patience. One phrase caught my eye, repeated several times: "They can't know." It was written in various spots throughout the notebooks, underlined in places, bolded in others. The ink pressed so hard it bled through the pages. I couldn't shake the feeling that the phrase was some kind of warning, a message left for anyone who stumbled upon this hidden space. The realization that it was meant for me, to keep quiet, to leave it be, clawed at my nerves. With each page I turned, I felt as if I were crossing some unspoken boundary, violating a space that wasn't mine to discover. My hands shook as I reached the last page, the ink fresh, as though the last entry had been written only days, if not hours ago. I dropped the notebook onto the table, feeling the walls close in around me, the air thick and stifling. I couldn't stay here any longer, couldn't bear the weight of the knowledge pressing down on me. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and pushed the wall until it clicked shut, sealing the doorway as if locking away the fear that had seeped into me. But as I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, hidden in the corners, unseen but present. After closing the hidden door, I leaned against the wall, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. The quietness of my house felt distorted, as though the walls held secrets I had been blind to. Standing there, the reality of what I'd just uncovered sank in, and a thick dread filled the pit of my stomach. Someone had been living here, moving through these rooms, unseen and undetected. My own home, the place where I had always felt safe, now felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I walked through each room, checking locks, feeling the need to reinforce the boundaries between myself and that hidden space. But it did little to calm the unease churning inside me. In every shadowed corner, in every quiet creak, I imagined the presence of whoever had once lived here, as if they were watching, biding their time. Each time I tried to brush it off, the images of that room flooded back. Footprints, the coffee cup, the strange notes, proof that I had not been alone. That night, I stayed awake long after midnight, each noise amplified, every shifting shadow causing my pulse to quicken. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, that my mind was inventing dangers that weren't there. But the memory of those notebooks, of that strange phrase repeated over and over, wouldn't let me forget. They can't know. I didn't know who they were, but the words left an unshakable chill. As if a warning had been passed down just for me. As darkness settled in, a sense of vulnerability washed over me. The house creaked and groaned as it always had, but tonight every sound felt deliberate, loaded with intent. Each rustle, each whisper of wind against the walls felt amplified. I lay in bed, blankets pulled up to my chin, eyes scanning the dim shadows in my room. The air felt thick, as though something unseen lingered just out of view, waiting. Hours slipped by in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The slightest creak sent my heart racing, and every passing minute felt like a test, daring me to close my eyes and surrender to sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the hidden room, to the notebooks, to the ticking clock that continued counting down time in that cold, secret space. I imagined shadows creeping along the walls, slipping through cracks, always just beyond my reach. Each time I drifted toward sleep, I would jolt awake, haunted by the thought of that room and the traces left behind. I was wide awake when dawn finally broke, the first light creeping through the windows. But the relief was hollow. I knew this fear wouldn't vanish with the sun. It had buried itself deep, a permanent fixture in my thoughts. Over the following days, I couldn't bring myself to go near that hallway, let alone the hidden door. Every time I walked past, my gaze would linger, and my mind would be flooded with images from that room. The thought of opening it again, of seeing the table, the notebooks, made my skin crawl. It was as if acknowledging the door, even in passing, would invite something dark and unknown into my life that I couldn't escape. I debated telling someone, maybe a friend or a neighbor, about what I had found, but each time I held back, afraid of what they might think. I knew they would question why I hadn't reported it, why I hadn't tried to figure out who had been there. But how could I explain that a part of me didn't want to know? Some questions, I realized, were better left unanswered, sealed away in the silence of that hidden room. As the days went on, the fear didn't fade. Instead, it settled into a quiet, gnawing presence at the back of my mind. Every noise, every creak of the house felt like a reminder of the secrets lurking just behind that wall. I found myself avoiding certain parts of the house, moving through my own home as if I were the intruder. The hidden room had become a shadow, haunting every corner, every moment of solitude. The memory of that hidden room is as vivid as ever. I can't bring myself to go back, to open the door and face what I might find inside. Some nights, I still lie awake, listening to the silence, wondering if the person who once occupied that space is still out there, watching, waiting for a chance to return. The drive into the woods was a long one, a narrow path that twisted deeper into isolation with every mile. We'd chosen this spot because it was remote, untouched by hikers or the usual campers who littered the trails closer to town. Here, we would have nothing but the trees, the sky, and silence, a peaceful break from our everyday routines. As we parked, the quiet settled over us like a heavy blanket. We set up our tent near a small clearing, excited for the solitude we had sought. But then, as we gathered wood for the fire, we noticed something strange. A lone figure standing by a small campfire a short distance away. They were just far enough that we couldn't make out details, only the still shape illuminated by flickering flames. They didn't seem to move, didn't react to our presence, just stood there, facing the fire, as if lost in some silent ritual. A shiver ran through me as I watched, unsettled by the figure's stillness. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just another camper. People came to the forest to be alone, after all, and we weren't the only ones drawn to the peace of isolation. Still, something about them felt off. A lingering unease settled into the back of my mind as night fell around us. As hours passed, curiosity gnawed at us. The figure remained there, motionless by the fire, never moving, never acknowledging us. It was eerie to the point of becoming unsettling, and though we tried to ignore it, the image of the unmoving silhouette began to weigh on us. Finally, unable to shake the feeling of something strange, we decided to approach the site, if only to break the tension and reassure ourselves that it was nothing. Walking closer, our flashlight beams swept across the trees, bouncing off branches and casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dark. When we reached the campsite, our footsteps slowed. The scene was empty. There was no tent, no backpack or belongings, no trace of a person, just the campfire, reduced to glowing embers, the warmth lingering in the air. I knelt beside it, placing a hand over the dying fire, feeling the heat against my skin, proof that someone had been there just moments before. A chill crept up my spine as we stood there in silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Whoever they were, they hadn't left any sign of their presence beyond the fire, no trace of gear or even footprints. It was as though they had vanished, leaving only the fading embers behind. We exchanged uneasy glances before slowly retreating to our own campsite, the quiet of the forest pressing in around us. Back at our campsite, an unsettling silence hung in the air. The thought of the empty campsite, with its lingering warmth and the absence of any belongings, played over and over in my mind. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something felt deeply wrong. I couldn't shake the image of that lone figure, standing so still by the fire, and the way they seemed to vanish without a trace. The forest, once a place of calm, now felt oppressive, every shadow stretching a little too long, every rustle of leaves amplified against the silence. We sat by our fire, watching the flames dance, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, barely speaking. The atmosphere had changed. The solitude we had sought now felt isolating, as though something unseen was watching from the dark, waiting. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on tired nerves and the strangeness of finding an empty site. But no matter how hard I tried, the weight of it remained, pressing down on us as night fell around our campsite. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire and the faint rhythmic rustling from the depths of the trees. The stillness was broken by a soft rustling, barely audible at first, drifting from the dark woods. I perked up, straining to listen, my eyes fixed on the trees beyond the firelight. The noise grew, a faint series of snaps and shifts in the underbrush, as though something or someone was moving, staying just beyond our sight. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us scanning the shadows, flashlights flickering into the darkness, but revealing nothing. As the noises continued, they seemed to circle around us, moving slowly, deliberately, never venturing close enough to see. A series of soft, deliberate footsteps followed, trailing along the edges of our campsite, inching nearer with each pass. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my flashlight tighter, aiming its beam into the trees. But each time the light cut through the darkness, it revealed only empty spaces between the trunks, nothing to explain the sounds that had become almost rhythmic, circling us in the dark. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to reassure each other, telling ourselves it was just animals foraging in the night. But the sounds continued, coming closer and closer, only to stop, abruptly, just out of reach. None of us dared to close our eyes or turn our backs on the darkness, each of us held captive by the strange sounds and the feeling of something just beyond the light, watching, waiting. As the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder, closer, as though something unseen had taken an interest in our small camp. The night air felt thick, pressing down with an intensity that was almost suffocating. We kept our flashlights trained on the trees, but every time we thought we saw a figure, a movement, it would vanish as soon as the light touched it. The shadows danced, taking on shapes that disappeared just as quickly as they appeared, leaving us questioning if we'd really seen anything at all. The sounds of footsteps became distinct, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite as if something or someone was pacing around us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in the silent spaces between the sounds. My companions were just as tense, our eyes darting to each movement, each rustle, knowing that whatever was out there was watching, observing. And yet, despite our attempts to catch sight of it, the figure, or figures, remained hidden, always a step beyond our reach. We clung to the firelight, our only source of comfort in the encroaching darkness. The sounds would pause, leaving us holding our breath, straining to hear the faintest hint of movement, only for them to start up again, closer, louder. It was a silent game of cat and mouse, and we were the ones trapped, helpless and exposed in the open night. None of us dared to sleep. We sat close to the dying fire, feeding it scraps of wood to keep the light alive, each of us haunted by the memory of the figure standing by the fire earlier that evening. Time stretched, each minute feeling longer than the last as we kept vigil, watching the darkness with tired, anxious eyes. I could feel exhaustion weighing down on me, but the fear of closing my eyes, of letting my guard down, kept me painfully alert. The forest had fallen eerily silent now, as if even the nocturnal creatures had sensed the tension and retreated to safety. Only the crackling fire broke the silence. But even that felt fragile, as though the flames themselves were afraid. The night felt endless, each flicker of light casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and writhe along the ground. As dawn inched closer, the footsteps and rustling seemed to fade, as if whatever had been out there was slipping back into the hidden depths of the forest. But the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the firelight, didn't fade with it. We sat in silence, each of us grappling with the unspoken fear that had gripped us through the long, sleepless night. When the first light of dawn crept over the trees, a sense of relief washed over us, but it was hollow, tainted by the events of the night. We agreed in silence. It was time to leave. None of us spoke much as we packed up, working quickly, casting nervous glances into the forest with every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. Even in daylight, the trees seemed to loom, casting long shadows that made us feel as though we were still being watched. As we gathered our things, we passed by the empty campsite once more. The ashes from the fire were cold, scattered across the ground, as though the camp had been abandoned for days. It looked deserted, untouched, just as it had the night before, and yet the memory of that figure standing by the flames lingered, as vivid and unsettling as ever. I felt a shiver run through me, and I turned away, unwilling to spend another moment near the site. We set off down the narrow path that would take us back to our car, each of us moving quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. I kept my eyes trained on the ground, unwilling to look back, afraid of what I might see lurking in the shadows. As we walked, the memory of the night clung to us, an invisible weight that refused to lift. Even after we left the forest, the sense of unease didn't vanish. The memory of the silent figure, of the sounds that had circled us in the dark, remained vivid in my mind, replaying like a broken record. The abandoned hospital had been part of town lore for as long as I could remember. The place loomed at the edge of town, dark and imposing, its windows shattered, paint peeling, and walls cracked by years of neglect. People told stories about it, whispers of strange noises, shadows moving in the empty rooms, and the odd sensation of being watched. I'd always dismissed it as just stories, exaggerations told to scare those bold enough to venture near. We had explored the hospital before, walking through decayed hallways lined with rusted beds and broken cabinets. The walls were covered in faded posters, the kind that once encouraged hope and healing, but now only added to the sense of desolation. Most of the rooms were empty, save for crumbling furniture and scattered remnants of medical equipment. There was a quiet stillness in the air, a kind of uneasy silence that seemed to swallow every sound. On our last visit, though, we found something different. Deep within the building, past the empty wards and abandoned treatment rooms, we stumbled upon a heavy metal door, standing stark and clean against the decay. Unlike the rest of the hospital, this door was untouched by time. It looked almost new, its metal surface smooth and unblemished, as though someone had installed it recently. There was no keyhole, no handle, just an unyielding barrier that felt out of place. We tried to open it, pushing and pressing against it, but it didn't budge. The door was solid, as if bolted shut from the other side. Curiosity gnawed at me, and as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was hiding something. We vowed to return the next night, determined to uncover whatever secrets lay behind it. The next day, the anticipation weighed on me, growing with each passing hour. I kept picturing the door, wondering what could possibly lie beyond it. The abandoned hospital was old, its closure years in the past, and yet that door seemed untouched by time, immune to the decay that had claimed the rest of the building. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, like it held answers to questions I hadn't thought to ask. As night fell, we returned, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we made our way through the familiar empty halls. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on the cracked tiles. The shadows seemed deeper, more menacing, the air carrying a strange, stale odor that clung to the walls. When we reached the corridor with the metal door, my heart skipped a beat. The door was different, slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a thin sliver of darkness beyond. My pulse quickened as I moved closer, hands trembling. We hadn't left it like this. Yesterday, it had been sealed tight, unmovable. But now, as I peered through the crack, the unknown seemed to beckon. I felt a mix of fear and excitement as I pushed the door open, revealing a hallway that was like stepping into another world. Unlike the decayed hospital around it, this corridor was pristine, untouched. My skin prickled with a sense of wrongness, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I stepped inside, I felt a chill, like I had crossed an invisible threshold into a place where time had stopped. The corridor stretched out before us, filled with medical equipment that looked brand new. Gurneys lined the walls, IV stands gleamed under flickering fluorescent lights, and supply carts were stocked with everything from syringes to rolls of bandages. Everything was clean, untouched, as if the hospital had never been abandoned at all. My flashlight swept across a desk cluttered with scattered papers, patient files, and notes. I picked one up, squinting to read the faded text. The dates on the files were recent, too recent, last year, maybe even a few months ago. But that didn't make sense. The hospital had been closed for years, left to rot and crumble. And yet, here in this corridor, it was as if the past had refused to fade, holding on to a life of its own. The silence was eerie, pressing down on me with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. Each step felt intrusive, like I was trespassing in a place that wasn't truly abandoned. I glanced at my friends, each of us silent, too unnerved to speak. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above, flickering and casting odd shadows that seemed to move with us. As we moved farther down the corridor, a sense of dread crept over me. The door behind us loomed in my mind, an unspoken fear that it might close at any moment, trapping us within this strange, forgotten place. We continued down the corridor, drawn forward by a mix of fascination and fear. My flashlight beam danced over shelves stocked with supplies, the sterile white of gauze, the glint of metal instruments. Each item was clean, untouched by the dust and decay that marked the rest of the hospital. It felt wrong, as though we were intruding on a place that still had a purpose, even if that purpose was beyond our understanding. My hands trembled as I picked up one of the patient files, flipping through it with a strange, morbid curiosity. The names and dates felt disturbingly recent, and each entry seemed like it belonged to people who might have been here only days ago. My fingers skimmed over pages filled with unfamiliar medical terms, procedures I couldn't understand. It was as if someone had been keeping records, notes that should have been abandoned years ago but remained, frozen in time. The longer we stayed, the more oppressive the air became. Each step felt heavier, as though something was watching, waiting for us to overstep our bounds. I glanced at the walls, the floors, even the ceiling, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the stillness, the empty corridor, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over everything. A chill ran through me, a sensation of being somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I turned back toward the door, feeling a pull to leave, to escape before something happened. But before I could move, a loud creak echoed through the hallway. The sound of the heavy metal door slowly swinging shut. The sound of the door creaking shut echoed down the hallway, sending a jolt of fear through me. I whipped around, eyes wide as I watched the door inching closer, the heavy metal seeming to move with a will of its own. My heart pounded as the realization hit me. If it closed completely, we'd be trapped inside. The weight of the air grew thick, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. It was as though the room itself knew we didn't belong, that we were intruding on a space that had kept itself hidden for a reason. We stood frozen, unable to look away from the door, half expecting it to slam shut with a final, echoing thud. I could feel the oppressive presence in the room growing, a silent warning urging us to leave. The corridor stretched around us, filled with objects that felt both familiar and foreign, like relics from another time that refused to be forgotten. A creeping sensation began to crawl up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following our every movement. My friends shifted nervously, their faces mirroring my own fear. There was no question in my mind now. We had to get out. The door seemed to inch closer with every second, as if giving us one last chance to escape. As we turned to leave, a sound stopped us in our tracks, a faint rustling from further down the corridor, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, but no matter where I aimed the beam, there was nothing there. Just empty space, stretching into the dimly lit distance. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was a draft or a settling noise from the old structure. But each step we took toward the door seemed to provoke another faint, inexplicable sound. An unsettling creak, a soft shuffle, the kind of noises you'd expect to hear in a place still alive with people. The thought made my skin crawl, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, every muscle tense. Passing by a desk, I noticed more signs that didn't belong in an abandoned building. A jacket lay draped over the back of a chair, neatly folded, and a half-filled coffee cup sat beside a pile of papers, still warm to the touch. My mouth went dry as the truth settled over me, heavy and undeniable. This corridor, this part of the hospital, wasn't abandoned at all. Someone or something had been here recently. A sudden, loud creak tore through the silence, snapping us back to reality. The door was moving, slowly but surely, swinging shut with an ominous groan. Panic set in as we sprinted toward it, feet pounding against the tile floor, every step echoing in the confined space. The door loomed closer, but it was moving fast, each inch sealing us further into the hidden corridor. My chest tightened with fear as we ran, the distance feeling impossibly long, the door seeming to pull away from us even as we closed in. The sounds of our footsteps filled the hallway, mingling with the final echoes of the creaking door, and a sinking feeling gripped me, the thought that we might not make it out flashing through my mind. With one last desperate push, we reached the door just as it was about to close. I lunged forward, slipping through the narrow gap with barely a second to spare, my friends right behind me. We tumbled out into the decaying hallway of the main hospital, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we scrambled away from the door. The metallic click of it sealing shut behind us echoed like a final warning, a sound that left us shaken and silent. We left the hospital without another word, too shaken to even look back. The silence between us was heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by what we had just seen. The untouched corridor, the medical equipment that looked brand new, the recent files, all of it felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare that we'd somehow stumbled into.